Well, meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister says that the U.S. wants to negotiate with Tehran because it has not achieved any of its war goals. Abbas Araghchi met with Russia's President Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg to discuss the war. Araghchi said that he'd held very good talks with Putin, with both sides reaffirming their strategic partnership. Russia did not openly send Iran military support when the U.S. and Israel attacked, but at the meeting, Putin said Russia would do everything it could to ensure that peace is achieved as quickly as possible. All right, I want to get more now with Mark Katz. He's Professor Emeritus of Government and Politics at George Mason University. He specializes in Russian foreign policy, especially relations with Iran and the Middle East. Professor Katz, it's good to have you on the program. Iran supported Russia's war in Ukraine by sending drones and weapons. Does this strategic partnership, does it imply here a two-way street? I mean, is there a sense in Tehran that it's time for Moscow to prove itself?
Well, I'm sure that that's exactly what the Iranians would like. The Russians, though, aren't noted for reciprocating, or at least in an equal fashion. So they haven't sent the kind of weaponry to Iran. However, they do appear to be sending targeting information, or providing targeting information to Iran for its drone and missile strikes on, whether it's U.S. installations or Gulf Arab facilities. In other words, that the Russians are helping make these more accurate than they might have been otherwise.
Russia doesn't necessarily support a quick end to the U.S.-Iranian conflict, does it? I mean, I'm wondering, how is Russia benefiting with Washington and Tehran being such open enemies?
Well, certainly, with the higher price of oil, the Russians benefit because they're an oil exporter. That's their main source of income. They have to sell at a discount, but if the world price rises, then the discount is from a higher level. So it appears that they are getting a lot more money. And the other thing, of course, is that to the extent that the U.S. is involved in Iran, it's not paying as much attention to Ukraine, the conflict there. So I think that the Russians are benefiting from this conflict continuing.
Israel and the United States have said numerous times, they've said that the world should be terrified of a nuclear Iran. Why don't we hear that same warning coming from the Kremlin?
Yeah, I don't think the Russians really want the Iranians to acquire a nuclear weapon, but certainly, back when I used to be able to go to Moscow easily, the Russians made clear that, if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, they don't expect to be a target, and they don't expect Iran to behave differently than say Pakistan or North Korea. So they're just not as worried about it as we are, and in fact, I think they often think that we're not really as worried about it as we say we are.
Are they concerned in the Kremlin that if there were to be a deal on Iran's nuclear program, then we would see maybe a rapprochement between Washington and Tehran? And is that what Vladimir Putin really worries about and doesn't want to see happen?
Well, certainly, Russian specialists have said exactly that their worst case is not a nuclear-armed Iran. Their worst case is an improved Iranian-American relationship, because if and when that happens, then Iran really doesn't have very great need of Russia.
And would Russia then be out in the cold then, if that were to happen, if it had a U.S.-friendly Iran on one side and then it still had the war in Ukraine to deal with on the other side?
Yeah, they don't want to find out. Certainly when Iran was ruled by the Shah and U.S.-Iran relations were very close, the Shah actually had pretty decent relations with the Soviet Union, in the 60s and 70s. But I think that, in other words, an improved Iranian-American relationship would probably be in Iran that doesn't see its interest in helping Russia with its war in Ukraine. Although I'm not sure at this point Russia really needs Iran's help with that war as desperately as it did in the very beginning, because Russia now manufactures its own improved Iranian designed drones.
Professor Katz, let me ask you before we run out of time, what is Russia learning about U.S. military capabilities as it watches Iran fight back?
Well, I think what it's learning is that the U.S. emphasis on a smaller numbers of highly expensive weapons isn't necessarily an advantage when it comes to the Iranians having a large number of very, very cheap weapons that the Iranians seem to be able to hold their own. And I'm sure the Russians are studying this very carefully.
Professor Mark Katz, good to have you on the program. Good to get your insights into the situation, the ties between these countries. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.